So let's dive right into private access. And before I do, I kind of want to just give a small introduction to Zscaler for those of you who do know us, and maybe even those of you who don't. But Zscaler itself is a company that was built on providing application access control and security in the cloud. And the idea here is to move the security model away from the physical locations where you would have a set of hardware, to do your protection of your applications or your ecosystems, but to move that control away from the physical and into a cloud location. And that's what we've done with Zscaler Internet Access for the last 10 years. And Zscaler Internet Access is, you can think of it as a solution to protect your users when they're browsing the internet. And things like Office 365 or Google or Facebook or Twitter, these sort of things. And the idea is to make sure that users are only browsing legitimate things and not being affected by a lot of the malicious content that is out there on the internet. We take care of that. But during this journey of the last 10 years, it became very clear that a lot of our customers required a security solution for, like our Zscaler Internet Access, but for their private applications. So the request had been given to us by many of our customers to come up with something very similar for private access. And that's essentially what we went and did. We went and built Zscaler Private Access. And I'm going to dive into what that is in a minute. But just think of it as access to your applications, your private internal applications. And I'll deal with the details in a few minutes. Now, the reason why we really spent time thinking about this and building the solution out was during our time, our last 10 years with Zscaler Internet Access, we have seen a massive migration. More and more applications are being moved to other locations that are not within the corporate boundaries. And of course, the cloud is a big initiative. And as IT becomes more and more commoditized, this pushes the need to drive applications to other locations where it could be cheaper to run. But also, these corporate resources are not necessarily just being moved to the cloud or another location. Your other resources, your non-compute, your personnel are becoming more and more mobile. Think about today how many devices you have. You have your laptop, your tablet, your smartphone, and most of your users are the same, and they require the need to get out and work from wherever they are or access the applications from wherever they are. So they're no longer within the physical boundaries of your environment. And because of that, there are some challenges that our users and your users seem to face when it comes to accessing applications. And it really comes from a point of generational change. We are dealing now with a generation of people who are, myself included, used to accessing things on demand directly. And there's no need to connect to a network. We're no longer thinking about dialing up a modem or connecting to a physical line or plugging an Ethernet cable in. Everything just works. The internet is everywhere. And because of that, users have a high expectation of applications. Unfortunately, a lot of the legacy environments tend not to drive that direct access. And because of that, if you think about your traditional network environment, and I'm sure many of you probably have some sort of stack of hardware similarly represented to here in the middle. And let's be clear, this is important. This has always been needed by your companies because you needed to provide access for your employees and your third parties into their applications. In order to provide this access, you needed to create an exposed location for inbound access, a VPN gateway. And normally that VPN or that remote access situation was set up and then advertised on the internet. If you think about the way in which the internet was built, in order to connect to something, you needed to advertise. Someone had to advertise it so you knew where it was. And this is a traditional way of thinking because the new way of thinking is why should you share anything? And I'll come into that in a minute. But it's important to remember this because that inbound stack is there to protect you. You might have a DNS environment to advertise your VPN gateway. Then you have IP addressing, and then you have to protect that from inbound risks. So that's fine and all, but what happens when you want to extend that to an application that's out there in maybe your cloud environment or a third party? You have to build some sort of internal routing mechanism that basically becomes very complex. And in terms of how a user would see this and how a user's traffic would pass, it becomes quite cumbersome and actually, to be honest, quite comical how we've built this over the years. It's not exactly the most effective, and ultimately we end up bending access to solutions because we want to put them through our control stack. And that is what this is here in the middle. It's a control stack. And I can say from my previous life, I worked for a very large multinational company for a very long time, and we built this, and it's still in use today to some extent. But it's legacy, and it is something that needs to change because it's not effective. And to be very honest, I'm sure you all feel the same way, but using a stack like that, or for remote access, using a solution like that only frustrates your users. And you don't want to do that because obviously you want them to be using your solution. Now, before we dive into the technical details of private access, I want to address one major mega shift that I think everyone on this call and listening to this will actually fully appreciate. Now, I already mentioned that apps have moved, and that's clear. We're seeing the applications moving. And as I said, it doesn't necessarily need to be cloud. It can be somewhere else, the physical location, whatever. But apps are moving. They're no longer in that central location. And that has massive impact on the way in which you and we see both network and security. The biggest thing to keep in here, and I guarantee, I asked this question in the room, is 10 years ago, the majority of your work was figuring out how to connect your users from around the company, around the world, into your central location where all your applications were. So the kind of hub and spoke model, and therefore build the castle wall around that environment. But I guarantee that in the last, say, 12 months or even more, you've probably spent more time actually enabling internet access to applications or applications that are based on the internet for your users, and struggling with that real shift that a lot more of this traffic is now going outbound and no longer coming inbound to your environment. So how do you address that? And what is the impact of that to your ecosystem? The major shift that we see, and I'll leave this quote from Gartner on the stage on the screen for a second, but we are seeing the shift of the perimeter moving from the physical, which was obviously a physical firewall instead of hardware, to that virtual. If you remember the beginning of the slides in the presentation, I mentioned Zscaler was all about moving away from the physical and moving to you can call it virtual, but moving away from the physical and moving to a more universal global access policy solution. And that's exactly what the Zscaler Private Access is. It is a software-defined perimeter. It is moving the perimeter away from the physical and to a more granular and more dynamic solution. But what is a software-defined perimeter? Now, there actually are a few different variations out there. And for those of you who are familiar with Google, their solution is here in the middle, but Google actually has been actively advertising their own internal solution called BeyondCorp for many years. Now, BeyondCorp is actually fantastic, the way in which it works. Users are only ever given access specifically to what they need and nothing more. And this essentially is the key function of a software-defined perimeter, in that users are no longer able to see everything. They're only allowed to see the very specifics they're allowed to see. The idea of need to know is the real true methodology behind a software-defined perimeter. There are two key things to keep in mind about a software-defined perimeter. Before anything can actually happen, a user must be validated, so authenticated and confirmed that they have the rights to have access, so authentication and authorization. But then they also need to have their device being identified. That must happen before anything happens with terms of network or access to applications. You need to do full access control before the user is even allowed access to anything anywhere on the network or application landscape. Now, Google has their implementation, and that's fantastic, but Zscaler has a variation in here, and you can see it on the screen. I'll come into the details on that in a second. But one of the key things here is that we don't allow any inbound access to our ecosystems. So if you were using Zscaler Private Access, you would no longer need to advertise your VPN gateways, no longer need to advertise your portals, because we no longer require the inbound path. And I promise you, I will explain that in a minute. So let's talk about private access and how it impacts the way in which we've seen the world and the way in which we're going to see the world from an access control point of view. I mentioned a little bit a minute ago, but the Zscaler Private Access has four really important things that you need to think about. One is that we connect a user to an application. That's it. There's no network. The user never connects to a network. They'll never have access to a network. And if you think in terms of an IPsec tunnel, the traditional VPN way, a user connects to your the IPsec gateway, and they give it an IP address. And because they have an IP address, because of the fundamentals of TCP/IP, they can route across the network. With Zscaler Private Access, the user will never see the network. They only see the application that you allow them to see. And because of that, you can start making applications go dark or invisible. Thus, your users will never see what they're not allowed to see. And you can granularly define that I only want to allow my, for example, HR users to see the HR application, or for my finance users to see the finance application, and nothing more. And nobody else can see those applications. In fact, with Zscaler Private Access, if the user is not allowed to see the application, they will not be able to even DNS resolve it. They won't even know it exists. It's a full dark network or application. Because of that, we can do segmentation in a way that's very, very different. We can do true micro-segmentation where we say applications are only allowed access by specific people. Now, this is very different in that we're not actually because there's no network access, we don't need to worry about a user being able to connect to a front end and trying to knock on the door. If the user's not allowed access, they can't knock on the door. So we can actually define access by application segments. Think of it in terms of the old network segmentation security model, where you would have security zones 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Well, that was a network model. That can still be applied, but we do it at an application level. We actually move it up the stack. And this is done all over the internet using the power of the internet, the power of the fact that your users have access to the internet on their phones, their tablets, their laptops, everything, without ever really worrying about ever connecting to a corporate network again. I know that sounds like a lot, so let me show you a quick visualization of how things look. There are three things that Zscaler has, three key pieces of technology that we leverage. One is the app, the Zscaler app that sits on the user device, and basically it's just a traffic forwarding solution. It says, is this traffic that the user is generating private or not? And that's a policy that you would define. So is it private? Then send it to the private access solution. And then it connects to what we call the broker. And the broker is our big policy enforcement. It's our global cloud. And you can see in this diagram, we actually have some of those brokers inside of our partner cloud environments in AWS and Azure. But this is where all of the solutions are connected to, and this is where all the enforcement is done. So unlike having a physical device on your network, the policies and policy enforcement is done within the Zscaler cloud. And then the third part is that we need to get the applications to the user. Now, if you remember traditional VPNs, you connect into a data center and then you would route across through an IP address across the network to an application. We don't want to connect the user to the application, to the network. We want to connect the user to the application. And so that's where the Zscaler the Zscaler connectors, these little, on the number 3, these are the pieces of software that actually forward applications to the users. Now, not directly. Think of it in terms of this. The Zscaler app is somebody with a telephone. The broker layer is the operator. And Zscaler app is phoning up the operator and saying, can you please connect me to my application or to some other end? And then the old world telephone, the operator would actually call the end and say, the end user, in this case, the internal application, and say, are you willing to accept this call? And if so, the operator connects those two calls together. That's essentially what we're doing here. The connector is the receiving end, the user is the Zscaler app, and the broker is the operator in the middle. And because of that, we're able to do some really fun, fantastic things because we never expose internal networks to users. We never expose your network or ecosystem to anyone who's not allowed. Also, this means that because the user only connects to Zscaler, they no longer have to worry about where the applications are. So in this diagram here, that user could be connected to 3 different applications, one in AWS, one in Azure, and one in the data center, without ever having to worry about or even to know where those applications are. So let's just think about those 4 key tenets, or the 4 key issues or topics that we have from Zscaler, and how they play out in terms of an actual connection. So 1, your users are remote, or they could be wherever they need them to be. They're no longer on a physical dedicated link. They have Zscaler app, and they're on the internet, and they connect. They're only allowed to see the applications that you've defined. Your policy says they're not allowed to see any more, so they can only get access to the applications you defined, regardless of where those applications will be. With that policy, you can say how the application is accessed, who can access it, And also, you get a lot more information about what the access request was, where the user came from, for example. And this is all done over the internet, and this is a very important piece. I mentioned before that the controller, the operator in the middle, the Zscaler Cloud, connects to both sides of the phone call together. And that is the case with Zscaler Private Access. So there are actually two TLS tunnels, and I'm going to get a little bit nerdy for a second, but we have a connector and the Zscaler app that both connect using TLS tunnels with mutually assured PIN certificates. And this means that we can guarantee the integrity of the session, but also means that no one side is required to have the other. It means we actually connect these two together for the user experience to be wonderful, as all the applications are actually connected to the user wherever that user is. So the closest Zscaler enforcement node or broker where the user is. What's really powerful about this, and actually really interesting from a architectural point of view, is that I began by talking about Zscaler Private Access. And before that was how we came to Zscaler Private Access. And if you recall, I talked about Zscaler Internet Access being out around for 10 years. Now, private access in itself is these blue tunnels here on the right. So I'll get that to generate that here. Remember, these tunnels come outbound from the environment where you have your applications. So it could be a physical data center, it could be cloud. But the powerful thing here is when that user is on the road or wherever you may have them, and they are accessing your private applications, they still have access to the internet. They can access Google or Facebook or whatever. And one of the really powerful things that we do is that if you are using Zscaler Internet Access at the same time, you can actually ensure that all traffic from your users is going through a secured policy engine that you manage. Now, that policy engine is global. There is Zscaler Internet Access and Private Access. Now, I specifically show two clouds here because it's important to realize that they are separate cloud solutions, but it is one Zscaler environment. Now, the Internet Access traffic is being assessed and looked at, and malicious content is being removed. But with Private Access, we are doing full secure tunnel path management for you. To give you a small anecdote as to one customer that we have, one customer decided to use Zscaler Private Access for access to applications for third parties, which I'll come to the use case in a minute. But also they decided, well, if this third party is going to be accessing my applications internally, perhaps I should also secure the user and make sure they can't access anything on the internet or anything bad on the internet. So our customer actually rolled out Zscaler Internet Access to their third parties when they authenticated to Zscaler Private Access, because it was the one app. The Zscaler app enables both paths. And because of that, we were able to make sure that all content, when the user was connected to the private environment, the private applications, was being blocked going out to the internet, except for some select sites. And actually, that means that the customer could manage the policy that this third party had on the environment, all through a singular application. So it's a very powerful, unified security solution when they're together. But I'm showing both now, and I'm going to go back to private access and focus on that now. So let's kind of cover some of the big benefits of private access. And I'm not a salesperson. I'm an architect and engineer, so I'm not going to spend too much time on costs, but I'll talk about some of the ways in which this helps the user experience. So one of the key things is that the user no longer needs to think about connecting to a location. Once your users have Zscaler app installed, it will be transparent. You can also decide to make it interactive, but ideally it should be transparent. So the user will never see it, never think about it, and will only ever access applications by opening up a web browser, clicking on a link, tapping on an app, exactly like they would inside the corporate environment. There's no difference as if they would be in your network or as if they'd be on the road. The user experience is simple and easy. It's just like they were on the network, and there's no challenges or thoughts that, oh, today I'm traveling, therefore I need to go and connect to a different VPN gateway, or my application is now in Singapore, I need to connect to the Singapore gateway. No. Zscaler Private Access enables that access regardless, and the users won't know the difference. Because of the way we do it, we actually have a whole new layer of security. This is a different way of looking at security and shifts the security paradigm from what it once was to what it should be, which is granular control, true granular control over who gets access to what and where. And not just access, but who gets visibility. Private access ensures that only users who have been authorized and allow by policy get access to the applications they need. If that user is not authorized, they can't see the application. And that is a key fundamental piece for third-party access, but also for granular control, as I mentioned in my HR and finance example a few minutes ago. This security shift has a major impact because it also changes the way in which you look at your network structure, the way in which you've built out your security modeling as well. Now, this is great because it gives you more security, but also allows you to consider maybe, do I need to have all this physical hardware? Now, I'm not saying you should remove them, but it's certainly a possible option. Again, this comes to the point of cost. I've touched on the appliances, but we don't have any appliances. We're a software-based company. Everything we provide is software-based. And the important thing here is we don't want to roll out physical. We don't want to having you install anything. In fact, we want to empower the next generation of computing, which is virtual and obviously in multiple locations at the same time. And because it's via the internet, you can actually start optimizing your not just bandwidth, but your route paths. So one of the big benefits of Zscaler Private Access is you take the user traffic off your network. You're no longer routing your users across multiple locations because you have your VPN tunnel. You're actually taking them off your network, so you can reduce that and optimize your machine-to-machine or server-to-server communications. And it's stupidly simple. Once a user has Zscaler app installed, now, of course, as engineers, administrators, as we are, once the solution is in place with a policy engine and the connectors are in place, access will work. That's it. And in most use cases where we've rolled this out, we've never seen a challenge because the solution has been built from the ground up to be simple and easy to use. To give you an example of one of our customers that we work very heavily with Zscaler Private Access, MAN Turbo, Diesel and Turbo, obviously everyone knows their engines inside ships and perhaps trucks and buses. They are a very, very large proponent of Zscaler Private Access. And their chief architect, Tony Ferguson, he has built a zero trust network model inside of MAN. So zero trust is an extension of software-defined perimeter. The software-defined perimeter is the actual execution. The zero trust is the model on how we restrict access. And one of the key things that MAN has gone about is they've made sure that all internet access for the users going to the internet, so the Googles and the Facebooks and so on, is going through ZIA for every user, regardless of wherever that user might be. They could be on a physical site in one of their offices, or they could be in a coffee shop. But the good thing is they'll always have a guaranteed the same security policy for accessing the internet, regardless of where they are. And so private access, they've utilized private access in multiple ways to not only enable access for users that are remote into internal applications, but also to completely lock down applications internally and in their environment. Now, Tony Ferguson and I will be actually in Las Vegas in 2 weeks presenting the idea and theory about zero trust networking, and I'll show you a little bit about that presentation in a minute. But he and I are going to be discussing exactly how MAN and as well as with Zscaler Private Access have rolled out this zero trust network. So I've touched on a few of these use cases, but I think it's good to kind of summarize them as we get towards the end of time. So Zscaler Private Access actually has really 4 key powerful use cases, but there are others as well, which I'd be happy to discuss in another session. First is cloud application access. As one of my diagrams showed, the solution is, our Zscaler solution is built in the cloud. And because it's built in the cloud, we also have our partners in AWS and Azure that we leverage. And so we can actually, and we have customers rolling out workloads in these environments. Now, if you have workloads in these environments and you want to migrate from your internal data center to a cloud environment, it's actually really simple. Your users using Zscaler Private Access would only ever connect to Zscaler, to the Zscaler cloud. And because they're only connecting there, they no longer need to know about the back-end physical environment. So one day, once you've migrated the users over to Zscaler Private Access, they're just accessing their back-end, as an example, SAP solution that could be in your physical data center. So then as soon as you want to migrate that across to your AWS environment, the users won't know the difference because they're only connecting to us, to Zscaler Private Access. It simplifies the access policy. It simplifies your route paths. It simplifies the way in which you interact with cloud applications. And as I said before, it takes the need off your network to route your user traffic across an MPLS or a VPN session. Now, because of that, that's very similar to, I guess you can say, to the next point, which is mergers and acquisitions. And this is an interesting conversation to have. But ultimately, if you think about a mergers and acquisition, most times there's a good 6 to 12 months of working out NAT on firewall rules, as well as DNS exposure across both environments. It's not a simple process, and it can be very complicated. With Zscaler Private Access, if your company wants to get access to another company's that you've purchased, you just need to put a connector or a set of connectors in that company's environment, and then expose those domains via your local DNS and say, use it now. This is actually one of our largest use cases in the United States, where we rolled out a number of users to use Zscaler Private Access over a weekend. It was a very powerful example and one I'd be happy to dive into with you individually. The next two, partner access and VPN, are very similar, as in they are both remote access to applications, and it could be in the cloud, it could be on your physical site, but both very similar in regards that it's a matter of setting up access for your users and your third-party users to get access to your applications. Normally, you would have a very open VPN for all your users because ultimately you trust your users. The difference in Zscaler Private Access is that you can actually granularly control who gets access to what, but also you get more ability to actually empower the user experience because the users are no longer going all the way across the world to the data center. They're only going to Zscaler, and we're bringing the application to them. This is similar with partners, but also you can really define granular controls. And in both cases, there is no user on the network. That's a very important piece. Users are never exposed to the network and never know the internal network anymore. So if your users were to be infected by something malicious, they wouldn't be able to spread any malicious content. They wouldn't be able to see anything they're not allowed to see. Zscaler Private Access only exposes what you allow them to see. So granular policy means granular access. So just a quick summary around Zscaler. Obviously, we are born in the cloud. That's our goal. That's our target. But also, that's exactly where we work every day. We believe in the idea of the cloud. And whilst we do also recognize there are some concerns from customers about the whole idea of cloud, we're happy to talk about that and address those concerns, as we've seen with many of our corporate customers. One of the key things to think about when it comes to Zscaler Private Access is that, yes, we are a secure path routing solution, and yes, we are making sure that your applications are being accessed to your users and nothing more. But we do it securely with your policy. There's nothing that we treasure more than the trust and integrity of you. So we ensure that it's only the most secure way of working for your users. And we offer a number of other things within the application to help manage things like, for example, corporate devices versus personal devices. That's all things we can address in depth at stage. Now, I realize that we're getting close, and I don't want to go over time. I'm doing pretty well, I can see that. So I'm going to kind of come to a summary of thank yous and pass on my contact details here. Please feel free to contact me if you do have any further questions. We also have a really cool interactive Zscaler Private Access demo that I would highly recommend you all go and try out. So zscaler.com/ZPA-interactive. That you just sign up with your email address, and we will provision a test environment for you to actually start testing Zscaler Private Access. You'll have 7 days to really truly try it in different ways. We'll build the environment has multiple ecosystems. There's parts and applications in AWS. There's things in physical data centers around the world. And the idea is to let you experience it for what it truly is. Of course, we have white papers and other things available on our website. And finally, before I sign off, we are having our inaugural Zscaler conference in Las Vegas. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, where we're presenting. I'm personally presenting with Tony Ferguson from MAN around Zero Trust Networking. But we have a number of cloud leaders, so the Senior Vice President from Microsoft Azure. We have a number of people like that who are joining us to come and present Zscaler's solutions, but also cloud and how it works. Now, I realize that it's only about 2 weeks away. if you are interested in joining and attending, please let me know or visit this link here, as we are very happy to have you. There will be, as I said, industry leaders in cloud, but also our engineering team, our senior management and executive team will be there as well, and be very happy to engage and talk to you on any topics at all. So with that being said, in a few minutes left, I'd like to say thank you and open the session up for questions and answer.
Thank you very much, Nathan, for your introduction to Zscaler Private Access. Wir wechseln wieder auf Deutsch für die Fragerunde. Nathan, ich kann dir die Fragen auch auf Deutsch stellen, oder? Oder soll ich sie auf Englisch?
Nein, du kannst auch auf Deutsch machen.
Du darfst aber auf Englisch antworten. Machen wir das so. Hä?
Ja, super.
Genau, für die ganze Audience vielleicht nochmals ganz kurz. Sie können weiter Fragen stellen. Wir schauen auf den Ticker im Chat oder Q&A-Fenster. Ich habe ein paar Fragen erhalten, die würde ich jetzt Nathan einfach mal in der Reihenfolge, wie sie eingegangen sind, stellen. Erste Frage für dich. Wie stellt ZPA, die Private Access Lösung, sicher, dass die Benutzer nur auf oder genau auf ihre Applikation zugreifen können?
That's a very good question. So one of the key things is that Zscaler Private Access works with our customers' identity providers. So rather than actually building an additional authentication solution to validate users, we actually leverage the existing authentication solution that most customers have. So anything that can talk on SAML 2.0, then we're very happy to consume that. And basically what will happen is we will say, oh, you're a user who's trying to access this. Are you authenticated? And send them off to make sure that they have the right authentication credentials. But also they're also allowed to see the application. They have the right permissions to access the application. What simply happens is the user gets redirected to your identity provider. You get authenticated, and then the identity provider sends back a SAML token that includes the SAML attributes that are things like member of or email address. And we use that and we consume that as part of Zscaler Private Access to make sure that those users are only those users with the correct membership, so the correct access rights are allowed access to your applications.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. Ich habe eine andere Frage noch, und zwar geht es ums Printing, um das Drucken. Wie funktioniert Drucken im Setup mit einem zentralen Druckserver? Did you understand the question? Okay.
Yeah. Great question. So we've seen this does depend on the way in which printing has been configured. Most times it's not a problem, but I will personally say that I have seen one where there's a geolocation performed of the IP address of the user to determine the right printer. Where we have to do some work on that, but that was the one thing we had a challenge with. But normally, it's no problem. Printing anything TCP, anything UDP will pass across the environment. And of course, if you have a print server centrally that requires a user to go up and maybe scan a badge to get the printer out, but that all works no problem. We're still sending the print job to the print server, and then it's up to the print server then to determine where to send the job. That's, as I said, needs to be dependent on the solution reviewed, but it should not be a problem.
Okay, thanks for this answer. Eine weitere Frage. Wir brauchen ja Konnektoren auf Seiten der Rechenzentren. Auf welchen Cloud-Services steht denn der CPA Connector zur Verfügung? Welche unterstützt ihr da?
Yeah, very good question again. So the connectors themselves, we have them actually available in both the AWS and Azure respective marketplaces. So you can actually today install them in your virtual PC or in your resource group at Microsoft, either way. It's also possible to run up a connector in other cloud environments. You could use it at Google, you can use it at Oracle and other ones as well. What actually, in fact, is the connector is actually a piece of software that we package on a very cut down virtual machine to run the software on your behalf. But it is also theoretically possible to install it on a Linux machine if you'd like.
Okay, thanks Nathan again. Ich habe noch eine gute Frage, und zwar eine sehr konkrete, auch für die Umsetzung, ob die Lösung Zscaler Private Access jetzt nur für on the road, also quasi für Road Warriors zur Verfügung steht, oder ob ich auch eine komplette Filiale, eine komplette Location damit abdecken kann.
Wow, that is a very good question. So Zscaler Private Access is about getting users to applications securely. That's really what it comes down to. Yes, that is certainly a comparable thing to a VPN or remote access situation, but it is also very possible to enable Zscaler Private Access to access applications anywhere. And users can, for example, if they're in your office and they have Zscaler Private Access running, you could actually say, well, you're in the office, so you don't need to access the local physical network applications through Zscaler Private Access because you're on the same network. But Zscaler Private Access has the ability to determine where and actually identify, it's actively monitoring where it is. Am I on the corporate network? Am I off the corporate network? And what you can say is that, oh, but there are applications that I want to access in the cloud. And of course, we'll still use that because you're never going to be physically on the cloud. So we can actually connect your users using Zscaler Private Access to the cloud. It is very much possible to have ZPA running both on your users' devices when they're in the office or on the road. I would actually even say that it's really a question of architecture and your end goal, but it's very possible, and I can say this with quite large confidence, it is very possible to end up in a situation where you have a physical office with nothing but just raw internet. So you have Wi-Fi, a really big Wi-Fi hotspot, and your users access your applications in a cloud environment or in your data center directly via the internet rather than going via a LAN or connection like that. And I say that with confidence because that's what many of my customers are actually doing. But it really it comes down to the solution architecture that you want to build. So the short answer in summary to my response there is you could actually build a solution for remote access for remote users, third parties, or you could even do it for all users on your network as well. So it really is down to the architecture that you want to build.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Ich habe noch eine Frage übrig, möchte aber Sie daran erinnern, wenn es noch Fragen gibt, dann stellen Sie diese jetzt. Wir schauen immer noch auf der rechten Seite in die Fenster. Die Frage geht um die Tunnel, Nathan, ob ihr statische Tunnel nutzt, beziehungsweise welche Art von Tunnel ihr nutzt für die Verbindungen.
Thank you. With tunnels, so yes, I think I mentioned it already, but the important thing to think about Zscaler Private Access is there's no static tunnel. And traditional VPN solutions are a static tunnel for everything. All applications go through the tunnel. Now, Zscaler Private Access has this individual TLS tunnels, and we actually don't have a static tunnel for all traffic. One thing I did not mention, I'm really glad the question was asked, is that our tunnels are actually per application. So think for a second if you had a web browser open on your device and you wanted to browse one tab. On one tab you had maybe your SAP or ERP solution open. That would actually have one TLS tunnel from your device going out. And then if you had another tab with maybe your holiday planning tool open to book your vacation for summer, that would be a second TLS tunnel going out. Then if you had your mail service open, there'll be a third TLS tunnel going out. And each one of these tunnels is actually established from the user going to the Zscaler cloud, and there are corresponding tunnels coming from the connector side as well. So there is no static tunnel. And the moment that session, whether it be the SAP, the holiday planning, or the mail application, any of those sessions is finished or terminated, the tunnel that we have is torn down. No tunnel ever is sitting there forever. We only keep it up as long as the application is active. If you want to, for example, if the session times out and you need to reconnect, you just click refresh on your browser and a new tunnel will be established. So the short answer is we do not do static tunnels. We do dynamic tunnels that are done on a per application basis.
Okay, Nathan, we need a little more overtime. Wir haben noch eine Frage erhalten, aber das zeigt ja das Interesse an der Lösung, das ist schön. Und zwar geht es darum, ob ein GRE-Tunnel, die man ja häufig auch bei Zscaler nutzt, in Verbindung mit der Internet-Access-Lösung, ob ein GRE-Tunnel in einer Filiale, in einer Location, dann quasi auch das WAN überflüssig machen kann, Wide Area Network, ob das überflüssig wird.
Wow, this is a good question. Okay, so in short, Zscaler Private Access uses TLS tunnels on port 443. So it's a TCP tunnel on port 443, and that's encrypted with TLS. That, of course, can go down a GRE tunnel. if your users are going to be using Zscaler Internet Access on premise and they need to access an application outside, there's no problem sending that traffic down a GRE tunnel or perhaps even a proxy if you wanted to do that. That's very possible as well. Of course, the most effective way is to go via the internet directly. In terms of WAN, this is a very interesting conversation, and it really depends on the architecture that we want to build out. It is possible to kind of separate the users from the WAN traffic and have them go via the GRE tunnel out to the internet and across the internet to your applications. And sometimes that can be more effective than going across the WAN, depending on how your solution is architected. Without saying yes or no, because I don't want to say that without actually knowing the architecture. It depends on the architecture, but yes, it's possible. It's theoretically possible, of course, but I want to make sure that each use case is worked through properly. So the answer is yes, we can put the traffic through a GRE tunnel, no doubt. We can also send it through a proxy. We can also send it direct. But also, from a WAN point of view, absolutely, there is a theoretical possibility of doing that, but it needs to be determined on what is the most effective architecture for your application access. And that's my job, to come in and help you understand that. So drop me a line, and I'm happy to talk to you about that specifically.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Ich denke, wir schließen jetzt die Fragerunde. Es sind keine weiteren Fragen eingegangen. Wenn Sie aber weitere Fragen haben oder eine Präsentation vor Ort wünschen, eine Teststellung machen wollen mit diesem Produkt, dann dürfen Sie sich jederzeit an uns wenden.